are sort of 20 to 30 watts, whereas, Libretis over a 2-week period consumed about $50 million worth of electricity. So these things are not the same. I think a couple of other things we need to bear in mind is, one of the things that sort of I'm very worried about in the context of AI, particularly systems that are being deployed, is that they tend to carry female names. So we have Sophia the robot, we have Siri, we have Cortana, and almost every day that there is some system that has been released, it's interesting to see that the name, very few of these things have male names, and I think that sort of points at a sexism or at least an underlying bias in the field as a whole that we need to be worried about. But nonetheless, we see AI all around us. We're using it right now as we interact on Zoom. One thing that isn't, one of the key requirements for trustworthy AI, I suppose so we characterize trustworthy AI as AI that is legal, ethical, and robust. And we tend to focus a lot on the success stories. And many people have been pointing to COVID-19 as an example of a success story, but it kind of wasn't really for AI. There were certainly lots of papers that were published on using AI for diagnosis and, typical convolutional neural network type approaches for diagnosing COVID from images. But it wasn't a good year or a good 2 years for AI. Lots of AI tools, literally hundreds of them, that were built to assist in catching COVID-19. None of them really worked in any useful way. So, specifically, there's a paper published in Machine Intelligence that, I highlight the sort of the key sentence in the abstract. They studied about 2,200 systems that were intended to, detect and do prognostics for COVID-19. And essentially, the punchline of this paper is that none of them worked. And so, while they're very fine AI systems from a scientific point of view, they don't really work in practice. And I think that points to, there are major challenges in how we assess our systems and how we deploy our systems and how they really have the impact that we want them to have. And of course, I think we're all aware of the kinds of things like bias and the challenges of deploying AI systems that learn from humans. Tay also sounds like a woman's name to me. But Tay was a system that was deployed on Twitter by Microsoft and learned from the interactions of human beings. And of course, it learned the worst of human nature because Twitter isn't exactly the friendly place for people. And also, I suppose, when people realized that Tay was learning from their interactions, it made the interactions a little bit worse. Against this backdrop, in 2018, the European Commission established a group called the High-Level Expert Group. The European Commission frequently establishes high-level expert groups. This one was on artificial intelligence with 3 tasks: to establish this community around the AI Alliance, which, if you're not a member of that, I strongly encourage you to go ahead and do so. To propose a set of draft ethics guidelines, and to I suppose, horizon scan for challenges and opportunities. Now, what Natalie hasn't told you is that she was absolutely instrumental in all of these things. And she, despite the fact that the high-level expert group did have a chair and a vice chair, I think we couldn't possibly have succeeded in any way, shape, or form if it wasn't for Natalie. So she's been very modest. I think the success of the high-level expert group was largely down to was largely Natalie's success and not ours. We were just merely there being told what to do by her, and we did the best that we could. So in the high-level expert group is interesting, and I think you should look at all of the work of the high-level expert group through the lens of its membership. So the membership was very, very, very diverse. People from civil society organizations, people from high-tech industry. So the chair is this tall gentleman in the center, Pekka Lepitala, former president of Nokia Mobile Phones. We had philosophers, we had ethicists, we had all sorts of people involved. 52 people in all, plus Natalie, so the most important member. And I suppose the 2 most significant pieces of work that we did was produce the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI and produce the policy investment recommendations. Now, these all happened in 2019. In 2020, we developed an assessment list for trustworthy AI because what we wanted to do was ensure that the ethics guidelines and this sort of thinking could be made practical and useful for those who are developing and deploying AI systems. Because while there's been lots of work on the ethics of AI, a lot of it is not very operational and it isn't really helpful in practice. And so the assessment system that we produced, and indeed the ethics framework we produced, is on 7 key requirements that you see here. And if you were to look at these through the lens of the GDPR, you'd find that they do sort of correspond to lots of the kinds of principles that you find in the GDPR. But that was not intentional. That was sort of is simply how it worked out. And so these 7 key requirements is what drove the development of the assessment list. Now, I'm not going to give you the assessment list in its entirety, but you can go to this website, you can find it, you can register. This is simply meant to be an example of what an assessment list would look like. There's nothing that one should feel is sacred in this assessment list, that this was a list that was largely generated through a series of brainstorming meetings of the high-level expert group. There are certainly things that it is blind to. There are certainly things that it sort of overdoes a little bit. And so, but I think the 7 key requirements and so on are important requirements. And I suppose what we really need to figure out is how are we going to make sure that the systems that we actually deploy, that we actually build together, are going to be trustworthy. And that isn't easy. We all know that there's a risk-based approach to regulation proposed by the Commission. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that works out. But again, regardless of how that works out, the kind of assessment activities that we need to do in the context of artificial intelligence are really, really important. And so today's event is really, really important. I'm delighted to be invited, and I think it's going to be a fantastic conversation. So thanks very much, Natalie. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Barry. And again, wonderful timing. You've covered a lot of ground in these limited minutes, from the history of AI, its potential and risks, and then also, of course, how the assessment list originated. So let's start with discussing the project that we launched a year ago and why we are here, why we're organizing this event. So how did we get here? As Barry said, the high-level expert group created this assessment list, and with AI for Belgium, we collected feedback on this assessment list, right? We had events with our members where we informed them and sought their feedback. And the overall feedback was that it's a very useful tool. And so we did not feel like we wanted to fundamentally touch the concept of the assessment list. But we did also get some feedback that the assessment list as such, it's not very flexible. It's also not tailored to a specific sector, right? The idea of the assessment list is that you can use it in any sector, but that has downfalls as well. The questions are also formulated a bit as not proactive, because the questions are, for instance, did you take into account the risk of bias in your AI system? So it's all as if you would have this huge checklist that you look at once your AI system has already been developed. Whereas the idea of the assessment list originally is that it's proactive, that it forces you to think from the design phase onwards what type of issues you need to take into account from the start. There are also some questions that might not be entirely clear. And also, based on this assessment list, I mean, you would basically need to sit into a room together with each other and go through it all at once. Whereas we know that usually, in order to answer these questions, this operationalization of the ethics requirements of the guidelines, you would need to work in a multidisciplinary team. You would need someone from legal, someone from web development, a data scientist, and perhaps many other people sitting together developing an AI system. And so you would also need all of these people thinking about these ethical issues around it. You also don't have examples in the assessment list of what you should do in order to make your system more trustworthy. So the question, for instance, did you take into account bias? Well, if you answer no, that's it, right? It's currently not guiding you towards guidelines or tools that you can use in order to debias your system. And so we gathered all of these feedback from our members. And again, in a nutshell, the feedback was it's a very valuable assessment list because it does operationalize important requirements for trustworthy AI that were also supported by the European Commission. But the tool needs to be even more user-friendly for us to really start using it. And so that is the goal of this project. We wanted to build on the work of the expert group, the work of Barry's tool, and just make it even more user-friendly so that public and private organizations can start using it. So in terms of purpose of this tool, It's not going to be a certification tool, and that's really important. It's also not going to be a legal tool in the sense that when you go over all the questions of the assessment list, you won't be able to say, okay, now I'm legally all fine with my system. That's not the purpose. The purpose of this tool is, first of all, to help you operationalize this assessment list in your day-to-day practices, in your business and organization, but also just to raise awareness of the ethical risks of AI, because by going over the questions in this tool, you'll be able to be aware of, oh, I need to think about that in advance, and ideally when I'm designing my system and not at the very end. So it's going to be for internal use in these organizations, helping you to raise right questions at the right time. And that's where we started, right? That was our idea when we said, okay, this is the type of tool we want to develop. Now I'm going to ask Tommy if he can show you the timeline, because I want to explain to you, how we got here. So basically, exactly a year ago, when we had the Belgian AI Week in March 2021, we had a plenary session. And I see many of the people that are present here were also present last year. So that's really nice. And so that's where we set out, this idea for the tool. And we also said, okay, to start with, let's just start with focusing on 3 sectors that raise some ethical issues. And we started with focusing on the healthcare sector, so AI applications used for healthcare, AI applications used in HR, and AI applications used in the public sector, because of course, many opportunities there. And so AI systems are being rolled out, but at the same time, there are some specific risks attached to these sectors. And so starting from there, we then moved on to organize specific workshops with stakeholders from those sectors. So we had 2 times 3 workshops with actual developers and users of AI systems in HR, health, and public services. So we sat down with these people. You also see the logos of the organizations who participated below. So great thanks for your participation. And so we asked them, okay, this is the assessment list. Try to go through it and let us know, what are the challenges that you're facing with, what type of tool do you need, or what features would you need in a tool to start using it. Then all that feedback was also validated in validation meeting with experts. And based on that, we developed a concept for a tool. And today, after gathering all that feedback from all these workshops, we're going to present you the concept of this tool. So let me stress, today it's a concept. This tool is not yet developed. The development will be for after this plenary session. This is what we're going to look into in terms of next steps. But now it's just about getting the concept of the tool right, so that we know once and if we will develop this tool, what are the priorities? What are the key features that we need to take into account? And for that, we need your feedback. So if we go to the next slide, Tommy. So this is, in a nutshell, the feedback that we got from these workshops with AI users in the several sectors and with experts. The tool needs to become more illustrative. This means there need to be examples given and understandable definitions. So when we think of AI in healthcare, in public services, and in HR, it would be useful to give some examples when we talk about, did you take into account the risk of bias in your system? Maybe to give some examples specific to that sector. So that could be an idea. Another thing we had a lot of feedback on is that the tool needs to be proactive. So we need to reformulate the question so that it's no longer, did you think about this? But rather, do make sure that you take this into account. And this hangs closely together with the third point. It needs to be iterative, because there are some questions that you don't just ask at one point in time when you develop a system, but there are questions that might come back and that maybe you have one answer to at the beginning of your project. But then once you're in the execution phase or the use phase of your system, you will have a more complete answer, or you will look differently at that question. So the questions need to be iterative. You need to be able, through the different stages of the project, to have questions recurring if they're still relevant for that phase. And the fourth point is that the tool needs to be collaborative. So I mentioned that a multidisciplinary team is in principle needed in order to answer these questions. Some of them have ethical nature, a legal nature, and you'll need to bring together people with the technical expertise and with the ethical and legal expertise to find an answer to these questions. And so ideally, the tool allows for collaboration and for asynchronous use, which basically means that I can work on it today, and then my colleague from the technical side can work on it tomorrow, and we can actually have conversations. I can say, hey, Sarah from legal, can you check whether these guidelines would be useful for this? So basically keep on working on it together. Then there are 3 more points. The tool ideally needs to be informative. This means that it needs to also point you to the right direction. So I mentioned the question, did you take into account bias? If you now click on no, that's kind of where it ends. So ideally, perhaps based on guidelines that already exist in the sectors or codes of conduct, we should be able to point you to the right direction, saying, oh, well, you can maybe look at this tool or look at this guideline. The tool needs to be documentable. So ideally, you should be able to have a sort of log of how you're dealing with the different questions of the assessment list, and also produce a report that you can also show to hierarchies saying, look, this is how we took these questions into account and how we solve potential issues. And then if all of the other points were not yet enough, the tool, after all, also still needs to be user-friendly. Otherwise, nobody is going to actually use it, even though the concept behind it is great. Okay, I think with that, Tommy, I'll give a quick example. Yes, I'll give a very quick example. So just here you see a question on accessibility, right? That's one of the questions in the assessment tool. Accessibility of an AI system, of the interface for people with disabilities, is an important part. And so right now, these are the questions that you see, but they're relatively abstract. So if we just go over the points I just discussed, the tool needs to be illustrative. So ideally, it gives you an example of how you can take that into account. It needs to be proactive. So you need to be able to see these questions once you're designing the tool and not at the very end. It needs to be iterative in the sense that you need to be able to have these questions coming back to you in different stages of the development. And it needs to be collaborative, so that maybe, again, I ask someone from web design, whether they can pitch in and give their ideas on how this can happen. It needs to be informative. So there are already standards on the interface of disabilities and how we can ensure, universal design. So ideally, there is a link towards these standards so that you immediately know that's where I need to look into. And then, of course, it needs to be documented. So again, so that you have an actual report at the end of the day that you can put forward and show, maybe not just to your hierarchy, but also to your stakeholders and clients. And now, Tommy, I will give you the floor to actually show the concept of how it could look like.
Okay, thank you, Nathalie. So my name is Tommy de Kimpa. I'm from UMIX. I'm an UX designer. So that means we turn applications more user-friendly. And what we helped AI for Belgium with, on the one hand, was to come up with these requirements for the tool. On the other hand, this stays abstract, of course. So what we did is we tried to visualize these ideas into screen mockups. So it's not an actual application yet, they are just mockups, but it makes it much more concrete, and it makes it easier for you and other people involved to give feedback on these ideas and to give feedback on the priorities that we need to set. Now, when you start off in such a project, somehow you will need to define your project. And there's a key role there for the project manager, who needs to, on the one hand, set up the project in the tool, but on the other hand, also make sure that all people are on board and needs to be the driving force behind the entire endeavor. And then what you see there is also domains of responsibility. So those are the domains where people have certain expertise, where people have certain responsibilities. So what you can do is you can assign people to those domains of responsibility. And those domains are linked to specific questions, which means that in the tool, people will be able to filter out and to see which questions they need answering, or on which questions they need to collaborate. Some ideas that we already gathered was that some stakeholders expressed that it should be possible to prioritize domains. Working in AI and trustworthy AI is not something that you do from one day to the other. It's a process where you grow. And it might be interesting to have some domains being prioritized over others so that you can work towards a more trustworthy solution over the time. Another idea that was also mentioned was that it should still be possible to assign specific questions to specific people. Now, what you see on the top right corner is also the sector, and that is what Natalie explained. The examples and the definitions might be different from sector to sector, whether you're in healthcare, HR, public services, or other sectors. So there you can indicate that. And then also, perhaps important to indicate is this is a SaaS solution, so software as a service, which means that you can collaborate with other people. So on the one hand, they might be people from the providers or the builders of the AI solution. And on the other hand, they might be the people from the user side or the client who actually uses the AI solution. So they can work together in this tool. Now, when we look at the main interface, what we see there is 3 different phases. So you have the preparation phase, the execution phase, and the utilization phase. Now, during the work that we did, we talked to many AI companies about the development process that they follow. And what we found is that there are as many processes as there were companies, but they all had one thing in common, and that is that they have these 3 phases. And there's a preparation phase in which you come up with the idea or the business idea behind the solution. Then you have the execution phase in which you actually build the solution. And then you have the utilization phase where the tool is being used and where it's being refined, etc. So those are 3 stages that we found everywhere. What else do you see? On the left-hand side, you see the different themes that were also explained by Barry or shown by Barry, the different themes in the list. And then in the middle, you have the questions. Now, for these questions, we looked a little bit, we're in the development space, like what is a concept that is well known into that development space? And we came up with the solution of a simple Kanban board, which is understandable for everybody, what is to do, what is busy, and what is done. So this can help you answer questions and follow up on your progress. And on the top right corner, you also see those little guys, which is basically filters, so that you can easily filter out only those questions that are relevant to you, but you can see the other questions because sometimes that gives a bit more context on how to interpret a specific question. Now, when you click on a question, what you see here is a pop-up with the question itself, and you see some words underlined. So that's where you place the definition. So if you click on a definition, then you see that pop up. Notice also that the question has been rephrased, so to start to be more proactive. You see some examples, and you can read more. You also see some recommendations, like Natalie gave the example of the accessibility requirements. Now, there are some guidelines on that. There are, for instance, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, which are very relevant for that. So it needs to be guiding, informative, put people onto the right direction. And then at the very bottom, you see the conversation view, where you can actually collaborate with the other members of your team. To end up finally with the conclusion. And the conclusion is the one that's also going to be end up in the report. So there needs to be a final conclusion there. What you see at the bottom right is you can answer questions. And normally the questions now are mostly defined as being yes or no questions. But as was already the case in Barry's tool, it might be a bit more qualified the answers. So it might be also that it is to some extent or on a scale of 1 to 5, or some questions may not even be applicable. If you're dealing with a tool for tax evasion, for instance, the question, are the rights of the child preserved, is maybe not the most relevant question for your specific project. Another thing that was mentioned is that it would be useful to put a due date on there. And that brings me to the next point, because in the main interface, you also see this button export to, which we found an important feature, but during the discussions, it became clear that this feature was even more important, and that is integration with existing tools, with a Jira mainly, or a DevOps, or a Trello, because those are the tools that are already being used, and the fewer tools they can use, the better. So it's really important for us to know that on the one hand, this is an awareness tool mostly to help people follow up on those questions, but our idea is not to create a project management software. So this is a feature that we already know that is really important to have this integrated with those project management softwares. Now, you can easily drag cards from one column to the other so that you have a clear overview, both the project manager and yourself, on what your progress is and how you're working on that list. Now, if we then click on the reporting, the checklist, what you see there is, of course, an overview of all the different questions, a bit more concise. But the idea is that you can also export this to PDF, because it's important that you can also inform management, for instance, about the different steps that are being taken. And here, one of the feedback that came on the tool was that somehow you need to be able to indicate also, like, okay, these are priority questions. These are the ones that we score well on, and these are the ones that we score badly on. And that's actually what you see in the score. So that already exists in Barry's tool as well. So where you have a results checklist, you see all the different domains that are in the checklist, where you see how well you score. And below you see a spider web with your score. Now, what we know is that it's not enough to say, okay, you score 64%, but is that actually a good score or not such a good score? So here we would like to introduce the concept of a red, amber, and green indication on how well you're doing. And that brings me to the spider diagram, where you see the blue is your own score, and then you see a red one in the back. And there are two ideas for this. One is that you can benchmark towards your own goals, so that you can set, for instance, okay, privacy and data governance in our specific case is a priority. So we set it there, or in this example is transparency. So then you can see how well you score to there. Or another idea that you have there is to benchmark against colleagues in the same sector, other AI solutions in the same sector. And that brings me to the final point, which is about the community building. So what came up is that for a lot of these, especially pilot persons, it would be interesting to be able to share best practices, to share examples, to learn from the examples of other companies. And for us, it would be interesting to have this community also, because we want to work in an agile way, meaning you start with a minimum viable or a minimum lovable product, right? And then as people are use it, you get your feedback and you can adapt and grow from there. So what we try to do with this is just to have those ideas that Natalie explained, to visualize that concept, so it's much more tangible. What you also heard is that there are a lot of features that were mentioned during those, or that came up during the workshops that we had. And so the purpose of this session is mainly to get, one, your feedback on the tool itself, and secondly, for us to have an idea on the priorities for you. So which of these features are the most important. And so in the breakout sessions that we're going to do next, we have foreseen two parts. On the one hand, we have an online survey that you can fill in, asking about what tools you're currently using and what the priorities of the features are. And on the other hand, we have room for a bit of discussion on that. And then after the breakout sessions, we will come back to the plenary where we will have some of the designated people just summarizing in 1 minute what we learned from the different breakout sessions. So this concludes the demo, which means that we can go to the breakout sessions. Here are some indications on how we are going to do that. So we are moving to 3 breakout rooms. Now we've named them HR, Health, and Public Services because there are some specificities. But if you are not active in one of these 3 sectors, just pick one. The discussion will be high level enough. It won't go into too much detail for this specific sector. So just pick one of the 3. Also important to mention is that we will record this session. And the recording will be for internal use only, so it will not be published publicly. Now, if you prefer not to be recorded, you can turn off your video or you can go on mute and just listen into the conversations. Now, how do we go to the breakout room? To go to the rooms in your Zoom, you have this icon in the Zoom menu bar. Now, if you click that one, then you will see 3 breakout rooms and you can select the one that you want to go in. And there you will be welcomed by myself, by Natalie, and by Lonneke, who will guide the discussion and the further work in that breakout room. So I'm asking our colleague to open up the breakout room. So everyone now, could you please find the breakout room icon in your Zoom, and then we'll see you there.
Hi, I'll make an apology up front. I've only just joined, so I've missed the first part of the presentation. Okay, so I might just be in listen-only mode for this breakout room. I apologize.
Okay, that's fine.
Not a problem. Just pick any breakout session you want based on the sector that is most of interest to you.
So, thought I pressed on public services.
That's great. I'll see you there then.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't see my name. Yves Poulet, I don't see my name.
I think you can just click on the join button next to the name.
Yeah, I've seen that, but I don't see my name. And I've already done. So that, I've clicked on public service.
Yeah. Okay, solved. Okay, I see there are still people who did not assign themselves yet to any breakouts. There are about 16 people who still need to choose. So if you're not part of any specific sector that we're dealt with, like HR or health or public services, just pick any. You can go to HR. I see that so far there's still a lot of space there. So to give your feedback. And I'm going to go now to the public service one. So whomever goes to that one, see you there. And then see you afterwards in the plenary.